In 1941, you've got this outnumbered general who was explicitly ordered to just, hold his ground.
Right.
But instead of doing that, he decides to drive this massive armada of empty supply trucks in these endless circles through the Sahara Desert.
Yeah, just empty trucks.
Empty trucks. And a few weeks later, that optical illusion of, dust and chaos, it completely broke the British Army.
It's incredible.
And then you go back a decade before that, to 1932, and you have this 39-year-old Broadway actress who literally hands back a $20,000 paycheck at this fancy Hollywood dinner.
A massive amount of money back then, by the way.
Oh, an absolute fortune. And she does this just to force a studio executive to admit that his movie script was complete garbage.
Which is such a wild power move.
It really is. So, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are looking at something that affects literally every single one of you listening right now. It's this universal, often entirely hidden struggle for control in every relationship, every negotiation, every conflict you're ever going to face.
Yeah, we are operating today from this really fascinating source text. It's called Control the Dynamic. And it is just packed with these historical case studies that stand from, like you mentioned, tank battles in World War II to the super glamorous but completely cutthroat corporate warfare of 1930s Hollywood.
Right.
And the core premise here is, honestly, it's a little unsettling, but it's so vital. It argues that whenever two people interact, there is this constant underlying maneuvering to define the relationship. Like who controls the pace, who decides the terrain.
Yeah, the invisible game.
Exactly. And if you don't recognize that this invisible struggle is happening, you are already losing it.
So the mission for this deep dive is to basically figure out how to stop exhausting yourself, stop fighting over every little petty argument, every single move, and instead learn how to dictate the very nature of the game itself. Yeah. And the text introduces this through this amazing concept from Miyamoto Musashi.
The legendary 17th century samurai.
Right. So in his Book of Five Rings, he outlines this strategy called pressing down the pillow, which, I gotta say, sounds weirdly gentle for a guy known for cutting people in half with swords.
It does, right. Musashi's phrasing is super poetic, but the actual application of it is this absolute zero-tolerance martial philosophy.
How so?
So, pressing down the pillow, it's the taboo of ever letting your opponent's head rise.
Oh, wow.
Right, meaning you never under any circumstances allow your opponent to take the initiative. The exact moment they take the initiative, you're instantly forced into a defensive posture. So you have to lead them by taking complete control of their intentions, like before those intentions even fully materialize in their own head.
Okay, let's ground this for a second, because I want you, the listener, to think about a time in your life when you felt entirely reactive.
Oh, we've all been there.
Right. Like maybe it's a boss who constantly sends you scrambling with these arbitrary last-minute demands.
Yep.
Or maybe it's a partner, and you just feel like you're perpetually playing defense. You're always apologizing, always just responding to the weather of their mood swings.
Yeah, you're the one being led. Your head is being pressed into the pillow, basically.
Exactly.
And that sensation of helplessness, human nature fundamentally abhors that. We all want autonomy. But the danger is that we often assume taking control means we have to engage in direct kinetic force.
Like fighting fire with fire.
Right. We think of conflict like physics. You hit a wall with a hammer, the wall breaks. So the person with the biggest hammer wins.
If someone yells at you, you just yell louder.
Exactly. If someone brings 3 statistics to a negotiation, you bring 10. We default to trying to win on paper.
But this source text gives us this illustration to kind of shatter that whole assumption. It's this archetype called the boxer, and it completely redefines what control actually looks like in practice.
Yeah, I love this part.
Because the novice spectator, right, they watch a boxing match and they think the winner is just the fighter who punches the hardest or has the quickest reflexes. They're just looking at the hammers.
But the superior fighter, he operates on this totally environmental level.
Yeah.
He doesn't just rely on raw physical attributes to win. Instead, he controls the ring.
Right.
He creates a rhythm to the fight that inherently suits his own style. He advances, he retreats, he moves the opponent to the center of the canvas, then he quietly angles them toward the ropes, then pulls them away again. The text actually calls this archetype a master of time and space.
And the profound takeaway there is the actual mechanism of defeat. Like, the text points out that by controlling the time and space, the boxer causes a mental collapse in his opponent that happens before the physical collapse.
Yes.
He wins not because his fists are magically stronger, but because he engineered this environment of just endless frustration. The opponent throws a punch, but the target's not there anymore.
They're bracing for an attack that never comes.
Right, so the fists are just the final formality. The mind is already broken.
And this translates so seamlessly to grand strategy. You look at military minds like Hannibal or Napoleon or Erwin Rommel. They understood that ultimate control means determining the overall pace, the direction, the shape of the conflict itself.
Yeah.
You don't try to control exactly how an enemy is going to respond to every single move you make.
Yeah.
If you try to micromanage a conflict like that, the sheer unpredictability of human nature is just going to exhaust you.
Okay, I do want to challenge this idea of environmental control a little bit, though.
Sure.
Because attempting to manipulate the underlying mood or the pace of a conflict, I mean, that sounds incredibly risky.
It can be.
It's like playing a fighting video game, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're mashing buttons trying to counter every punch, but your opponent hasn't just learned the combos. They've literally hacked the game's code to change the gravity in the arena.
That is a great analogy.
Thanks. But, like, you can't win if they own the physics. But isn't trying to hack the physics in real life, say, intentionally making your opponent angry or fearful, isn't that a massive gamble? What if you make them furious, and that fury just gives them the adrenaline to punch you twice as hard?
Well, the text actually addresses that precise vulnerability.
Yeah.
The argument is that if you truly dictate the mood, like if you effectively induce real panic or overconfidence or blind rage, the specific actions they take begin to matter way less.
Wait, really? How?
Because a compromised emotional state strips the opponent of their strategic vision. An angry opponent is going to make rash decisions. They abandon their defenses just to strike at you. Or a panicky opponent, they retreat into corners where they have absolutely no leverage. So you trap them mentally, ensuring that whatever action they take, even if it looks super aggressive, ultimately serves the dynamic you designed.
It requires a totally different lens on conflict. You aren't trying to block their punch. You're just making sure that when they do finally throw it, they are so furious and off balance that they leave their chin completely exposed.
Exactly.
And the foundation for doing this, according to the text, it starts with keeping them perpetually on their heels. And to really understand how that works in practice, we have to talk about the deserts of North Africa during World War II.
Yes, the Rommel example.
Yeah.
So the setting is late 1940, early 1941. The British forces in the Middle East have managed to secure their position in Egypt, and they've pushed westward, taking back this massive chunk of Libya from the Italian forces.
Who were allied with Nazi Germany.
Right. And the Italian forces, they'd proven to be pretty inept in this specific theater.
Yeah.
The British had just captured the vital port town of Benghazi.
So they basically have total momentum. They are poised to just roll through the rest of the territory, take Tripoli, and kick the Axis powers out of North Africa completely. But then the British commander, General Archibald Wavell, he makes this decision that literally changes the course of the war.
Yeah.
He just calls a halt to the advance.
And Wavell's reasoning here, it was rooted in very standard conservative military doctrine. He was managing multiple fronts across the region, and he felt his supply lines are getting way too overextended.
Which on paper makes sense.
It does. Plus, because the Italians had put up such weak resistance, the British were feeling this overwhelming sense of security. They calculated, hey, we can afford to pause, consolidate our gains, build a nice strong defensive line in Libya, and then we'll launch a leisurely offensive by, like, April of 1941.
They stopped pressing down the pillow. They traded the initiative for comfort.
Exactly.
And into that comfort zone steps General Erwin Rommel. So in February 1941, British intelligence picks up that this small German armored brigade has arrived in Tripoli under Rommel's command.
And Rommel was already famous at this point for his blitzkrieg tactics in France.
Right, but the British command structure was just completely unbothered by him showing up.
They were so dismissive.
Yeah.
And it was based on these seemingly solid, logical pillars. First, Rommel was technically placed under Italian command, which the British just had deep contempt for. Second, his logistical situation was terrible. He was entirely dependent on the Italians for fuel and supplies.
Which is a nightmare.
Yeah. Third, his armored force was genuinely tiny compared to the massive British army entrenched to the east.
And here's the kicker, right?
Oh yeah, the best part. British intelligence had actually intercepted direct orders from Adolf Hitler, explicitly commanding Rommel to hold a defensive posture. He was only supposed to act as a blocking force.
So the British are sitting in Cairo going, look, we vastly outnumber him, his supply lines are a joke, his allies are incompetent, and his own boss explicitly forbade him to attack. The spreadsheet basically says the British are perfectly safe.
But the spreadsheet cannot account for audacity.
No, it cannot.
At the end of March 1941, Rommel just completely disobeys his orders from Berlin. Without any prior warning, no massive buildup of forces, he just sweeps his tanks eastward into a full-scale offensive.
And he executes this in a way that just defies every conventional tactical manual out there. He takes this already inferior force and he intentionally fragments it.
Right, you look at it.
He breaks his army into these small, highly mobile, mechanized columns, and he just hurls them in these violently erratic directions against the British defensive line. The British commanders literally cannot fathom what his grand strategic objective is because visually it just looks like pure madness.
Rommel was deliberately generating chaos. He understood that his primary weapon wasn't his artillery, it was his speed.
Yes.
So he would advance these columns through the desert at night with their headlights completely dimmed, and then they'd just suddenly materialize on the flank or the rear of British positions right at dawn.
Terrible.
It caught them completely by surprise. It paralyzed the local commanders. The British line just shatters in multiple places, and General Wavell is watching this from Cairo, just stunned into inaction. Within weeks, the Germans push the British all the way back to the Egyptian border.
The text highlights the specific phrase to describe Rommel's methodology, and I love it. It says, he treated the desert like an ocean.
Yeah, that's such a great visual.
Because in a traditional European land war, you're fighting over specific terrain, right? Hills, roads, bridges. But in the desert, just like the ocean, there are no natural choke points. It requires perpetual fluid motion. His tanks just never stop moving.
And that perpetual motion was a psychological weapon. The British couldn't let their guard down for a single hour. And that kind of hypervigilance, it rapidly degrades your cognitive function and your morale.
Oh, absolutely.
But Rommel's movements, while they looked chaotic, they were actually heavily engineered deceptions. If his true objective was, say, to capture a specific coastal city to the east, he would openly dispatch his main armored force deep into the southern desert, heading in the total opposite direction.
So the British reconnaissance planes would spot this massive movement down south, and they'd frantically redirect all their defensive lines to intercept it.
Precisely. And then, once the British had shifted all their weight, Rommel's force would execute this massive sweeping arc through the deep desert and attack the original coastal city from the rear, completely bypassing the new defensive lines.
The environmental manipulation is what I find most fascinating here, because Rommel literally weaponized the sand itself.
The empty trucks.
Yes. He brought along this armada of just standard unarmored supply trucks, and he would order his drivers to aggressively drive them in these massive circles through the deep desert, solely for the purpose of kicking up gigantic clouds of dust.
It's so brilliant.
From the vantage point of the British scouts, they see this miles-wide dust storm approaching on the horizon, and it creates this terrifying optical illusion that a gargantuan mechanized army is bearing down on them.
It's pure theatrical deception, utilized to bypass the enemy's rational analysis. And Rommel compounded this by completely altering the traditional command structure, too.
Right.
Like, while the British generals like Wavell were stationed miles and miles behind the front lines in comfortable headquarters, relying on these delayed radio reports to make decisions.
Rommel is physically riding at the very front of his advancing columns.
Exactly. He shortened the decision loop. The British frontline commanders had to observe an attack, radio Cairo, explain the situation, request permission to adjust, wait for Cairo to analyze a map, and then wait for orders to come back.
While Rommel is just observing the enemy with his own eyes and redirecting his columns before the British even finished transmitting their first radio message.
And he fundamentally inverted how tanks were utilized, too.
Oh, the bait tactic.
Yeah. The standard doctrine was to use heavy armor as this battering ram to puncture defensive lines. But Rommel would instead take his absolute weakest, lightest tanks and send them directly toward the British lines.
The ultimate bait.
The moment those light German tanks made contact with the superior British armor, Rommel ordered them to immediately turn around and flee in what looked like total panic.
So the British tank commanders, operating under the assumption that they just routed the German vanguard, they invariably swallow the bait.
They hit the gas.
They pursue the fleeing Germans. But in the desert, a pursuing force kicks up a massive wake of dust. So the British tanks essentially blinded themselves in their own pursuit. They're barreling straight through this opaque dust cloud, hyper-focused on the weak tanks retreating in front of them, and they drive point blank into a hidden, entrenched line of massive German anti-tank artillery.
And they just get obliterated in minutes.
Hmm.
Once the British counterattack was neutralized, Rommel would unleash his hidden heavy panzer divisions to sweep forward and wreak total havoc behind the compromised British lines.
The text brings in a quote here from the Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz that perfectly diagnoses why this works so spectacularly against a superior force. He said, "Given the same amount of intelligence, timidity will do 1,000 times more damage in war than audacity."
Rommel's initial analysis of the theater dictated that audacity. He knew the British had a stronger position, and it was only going to get stronger as they accrued more supplies in Egypt. Every single day Rommel waited, the mathematical probability of his defeat increased.
Right, waiting was just a guaranteed death sentence.
So he risks his entire career, disobeys high command, and acts on the principle that making the very first deeply aggressive move completely alters the fabric of the dynamic. When you attack an enemy who feels secure and vastly outnumbers you, the psychological shock is disproportionately devastating. The British had the numbers, but they completely lacked the mental preparation for a chaotic defense.
And large bureaucratic organizations just inherently struggle to coordinate orderly retreats. Once Rommel introduced the chaos of speed and unpredictability, the British simply tripped over their own defensive protocols.
Yeah, they spread their forces dangerously thin, trying to cover every possible angle. Eventually, just the mere rumor that a German dust cloud was spotted on the horizon would cause massive, well-supplied British units to spontaneously abandon their positions.
Which is wild. The source text actually ties this historical reality to a metaphor from ancient literature, specifically Homer's Iliad.
Oh, the river Xanthus metaphor.
Yeah. It compares the psychological effect of Rommel's constant pressure to the warrior Achilles slaughtering the Trojans at the river. Break that down for us.
So in the epic, Achilles splits the Trojan army. Half of the terrified soldiers flee toward the city gates, but the other half are basically herded into the deep churning waters of the river Xanthus. And the text uses this vivid natural metaphor to describe it. It says, fire will sometimes cause a swarm of locusts to rise in the air and fly to a river. The fire keeps coming, burning them instantly, and the insects shrink down into the water.
The audacity is the fire.
Yes.
It doesn't just burn the enemy, it drives them into the water, into blind panic, into systemic mistakes.
Exactly.
But, okay, we need to translate this massive military operation into the reality of everyday life. Because if you're listening to this and thinking, okay, I get the historical brilliance, but I don't command a mechanized battalion, consider the structure of modern corporate culture. Consider that subtle, creeping defensive posture we all fall into at work, or even in complex family dynamics.
The text is really explicit about this. Society conspires to put the individual on the defensive. Superiors at work often desire to maintain a complete monopoly on initiative. They actively discourage proactive behavior because it threatens their control. The modern workplace is just this barrage of urgent emails, arbitrary deadlines, micromanagement. It keeps you locked in a perpetual state of reaction.
They condition you to ask for permission. You're constantly reminded of your limitations. You don't have the budget, you don't have the clearance, you need to run this up the flagpole.
Oh, constantly.
They make you feel guilty for dropping a ball that they deliberately threw at your head when you weren't looking. And over time, that defensiveness metastasizes into your personality. You shrink. You just sit there and wait to be told what your next task is.
You cede the terrain. To break that cycle, the text argues you have to apply Rommel's audacity. You have to fundamentally liberate yourself from the psychological weight of being on defense. You move to seize the initiative before the other party is even prepared to engage.
Meaning you complete the analysis before the manager asks for it. You propose the radical solution before they even schedule the meeting to complain about the problem. You stop asking how they want a project done, and you start telling them how you're going to execute it.
And by initiating that push, you alter the gravity of the relationship. Instead of you frantically reacting to their vague anxieties, they're suddenly forced to react to your concrete actions.
Yes.
This inherently makes you appear larger, more competent, and more powerful than whatever your actual title on the org chart might suggest. You generate a healthy respect and maybe even a subtle apprehension, which translates directly into offensive leverage.
But audacity requires at least a baseline of resources or like the ability to move quickly. What happens when you step into an arena where you are fundamentally the underdog, where you hold absolutely zero logistical power and your opponent already controls the entire battlefield?
Right, so that shifts us from the kinetic warfare of the Sahara to the highly structured corporate warfare of Hollywood in 1932. This is the story of how to dictate the dynamic when you are completely outgunned.
And this story centers on the legendary Mae West. So in 1932, the American film industry was dominated by a few massive studios, and Paramount Pictures was attempting to capitalize on this huge public craze for gangster films.
Yeah, they greenlit a production called Night After Night, starring George Raft, who had just made a massive splash in the quintessential gangster film Scarface.
But the producer of Night After Night, William LeBaron, he realizes during pre-production that his cast is just entirely too heavy and serious. The film was supposed to have this lighter, comic edge, but the actors are playing it like a grim tragedy. They desperately needed an injection of levity.
So George Raft suggests they bring in Mae West, and the context here is super vital. Mae West was a massive controversial celebrity at the time, but entirely within the realms of vaudeville and Broadway.
Right.
She wrote her own plays, which were wildly successful, but she was known for this incredibly witty, saucy, aggressive persona.
The Hollywood studio executives were well aware of her, but they had universally dismissed her. They operated under these strict censorship guidelines, and they considered her material just way too bawdy for mainstream cinema.
And Hollywood was intensely youth-obsessed even back in the 1930s. Mae West was 39 years old. The executives basically considered her too plump, too old, and completely inappropriate for a cinematic debut.
Despite this overwhelming bias, LeBaron decides the film needs a shock to the system. So the studio's plan is incredibly cynical. They want to bring her in solely for the promotional value of her scandalous reputation, let her perform a few minor comedic scenes, and then just discard her back to New York.
Right.
So they offer her a brief 2-month contract for the staggering sum of $5,000 a week.
Which is huge. So West accepts the offer and travels to Los Angeles. And the friction is instantaneous. The studio immediately demands she go on a strict diet to conform to their visual standards.
And what does she do?
West, completely understanding that her physical presence was part of her power, she just completely ignores them. Instead, she further antagonizes the studio's sensibilities by dyeing her hair this aggressively bright, almost indecent shade of platinum blonde.
I love that. And then she reads the script for Night After Night. She finds the dialogue totally lifeless and her character utterly peripheral. So she approaches the studio and offers her services as a writer to completely rewrite her own part.
We really have to pause and look at the power dynamics of the 1932 studio system here. The studios literally owned their actors through these draconian contracts. The executives, like the head of Paramount, Adolph Zukor, they had decades of experience dealing with difficult, egomaniacal stars.
They had a whole playbook for crushing rebellion.
Exactly. But an actress, especially one making her film debut offering to rewrite the studio script, it was unprecedented. The executives flatly refused. They argued it would set a catastrophic precedent for every other actor on the lot.
So Mae West makes her first major strategic move. She refuses to step foot on the set unless she is allowed to rewrite her dialogue.
And Zukor recognizes that the film genuinely needs her energy, so he deploys a classic executive management tactic. He assigns a high-ranking studio executive to take Mae West out to this opulent birthday dinner.
The schmoozing tactic.
Right. The objective is to cajole her, flatter her ego, promise her all these future opportunities, and subtly bully her into compliance so the cameras can finally roll.
But West is operating on a totally different strategic plane. At this lavish dinner, right as the executive is launching into his practice sweet talk, West reaches into her handbag. She pulls out a piece of paper and slides it across the table. It is a check for $20,000.
That check represented every single cent she had earned from the studio up to that exact moment in her contract. She was voluntarily returning a fortune. She calmly thanked Paramount for the opportunity, but informed the executive she was taking the train back to New York the following morning.
Adolph Zukor receives the phone call detailing this dinner, and his entire framework just collapses.
Yeah.
From his perspective as a ruthless businessman, this woman is willing to forfeit $20,000 in cash, risk a monumental lawsuit for breach of contract, and guarantee that she is blacklisted from the film industry forever.
And that willingness to embrace total destruction forces Zukor to reevaluate the terrain. He reasons, look, if she is willing to destroy her career rather than appear in an inferior picture, perhaps she is seeing something we aren't. Perhaps the script really is as terrible as she claims.
Zukor blinks. He offers a compromise. He allows West to rewrite her own dialogue, but with a safety net. They'll shoot two entirely separate versions of every scene she's in, one using the studio's approved script and one using West's rewrites. They'll review the footage, and the best version wins.
It inflates a budget, obviously, but Zukor assumes the studio's professional writers will ultimately prevail.
West accepts. But the moment production begins, she executes the next phase of her strategy. She shifts the battlefield again. She begins to openly clash with the film's director, Archie Mayo.
And Mayo was a seasoned Hollywood veteran.
Exactly. West was no longer just arguing about words on a page. She began dictating the physical blocking of the scenes, where she stood, how she moved, and the specific placement of the cameras.
There's this legendary argument over a specific shot. West delivers one of her trademark rapid-fire wisecracks and immediately demands the camera capture a specific shot of her slowly walking up a staircase afterward.
Yeah.
She argues that the audience needs that precise visual beat to finish laughing before the next line of dialogue happens.
Right.
The director refuses, calling it a self-indulgent waste of expensive film stock.
Yeah.
So West simply walks off the set. Production grinds to a halt.
The executives are forced to intervene again. They review the daily footage and realize, to their horror, that West's rewritten dialogue is spectacular. It's saving the movie. So they instruct the director to placate her. They tell Mayo to let her direct her own scenes, assuming that whatever structural mess she creates on set, the studio's brilliant editors can easily fix in post-production.
They assume they hold the ultimate power in the editing room.
Meanwhile, the other actors are furious. Alison Skipworth, this veteran actress sharing scenes with West, complains bitterly to the producers that West is hijacking the internal rhythm of the scenes, forcing the camera to linger on her, and systematically stealing the movie. And the studio tells Skipworth the exact same thing. Don't worry, we will fix it in the edit.
But that was the fatal flaw in the studio's assumption. When the editors finally received the footage and attempted to cut the film together, they realized they were completely trapped.
Oh.
Well, West, drawing on her decades of Broadway experience, had fundamentally altered the internal pacing and timing of the performances while the cameras were rolling. Her comedic timing was baked into the physical celluloid. No amount of editing could piece it back together into the studio's original fast-paced vision without ruining the comedy entirely.
Wow. So the movie premieres in October 1932. The reviews for the film as a whole are lukewarm, but the critical and public reaction to Mae West is seismic. The audience is mesmerized by her wit, her absolute confidence, and her aggressive ownership of her sexuality.
Yeah, she is only on screen for a fraction of the film, but she completely eclipses the stars. Lines she wrote herself like, "I'm a girl who lost her reputation and never missed it," instantly become cultural touchstones.
George Raft, the actual star of the film, later admitted with this mix of awe and frustration, Mae West stole everything but the cameras.
And look at the ultimate shift in power here. Paramount was hovering on the brink of bankruptcy and desperately needed a massive star. They could not ignore the public demand. At age 40, after being dismissed as too old and too unrefined, Mae West is signed to a long-term contract at a salary higher than any other star at the studio.
Incredible.
For her subsequent film, Diamond Lil, she demanded and received absolute creative control over the script, the cast, and the directing, a level of autonomy that was essentially mythic in the 1930s studio system.
The mechanics of how she did this are brilliant. If Mae West had stepped off the train in Los Angeles and attempted to fight Adolphe Zukor on his native terrain, meaning if she had thrown tantrums about her dressing room or her makeup, fighting as just another stereotypically difficult actress, she would have been crushed.
Absolutely. The studio had an entire infrastructure designed to win that specific battle of attrition. They understood the commodification of actors.
So West methodically shifted the terrain of the conflict. By handing back the $20,000 check, she instantly moved the battle away from managing an inflated ego to a totally different arena, the fundamental artistic and commercial viability of the script.
She lured Zukor, a businessman who was profoundly insecure about his ability to judge comedic art, onto terrain where she, a veteran playwright, held absolute expertise.
Yeah.
And once she secured that beachhead, she shifted the battlefield again, moving from the written word to the technical pacing of the direction. She outmaneuvered a veteran film director because she understood the psychology of an audience's laughter better than he understood camera lenses.
But I keep coming back to that $20,000 check, because the sheer audacity of handing back a fortune requires an ironclad stomach for risk. If we're applying this to modern conflicts, negotiating a salary, Fighting a corporate restructuring, dealing with a toxic power dynamic is shifting the battlefield, always reliant on being willing to completely walk away and burn the house down, because that feels terrifying and often impractical for a normal person with a mortgage.
It's a really vital distinction.
Yeah.
You do not necessarily have to be willing to embrace total financial ruin, but you absolutely must cultivate the psychological freedom to decouple yourself from the specific leverage your opponent is using to control you.
Right. Zucker believed the money, the paycheck, was his ultimate leverage.
Exactly. And by returning it, West neutralized his primary weapon and forced him to find a new way to interact with her. The text advises that your opponents will always instinctively attempt to engage you on terrain where their power is maximized, whether that is a debate over granular data, a screaming match where they can use their temper, or a financial negotiation where they hold the purse strings.
And if you engage on that terrain, you are fighting uphill.
Always. Your goal is to accept the reality of the conflict, but radically alter its nature.
So if you are in a negotiation against a massive corporation with endless legal resources, you don't fight them on legal technicalities. You shift the battlefield to public relations or morality, make them defend their actions in the court of public opinion where their legal budget is useless.
Or if you are dealing with a deeply aggressive individual who wants to escalate an argument quickly, you refuse to match their volume. You slow the pace down to an agonizing clinical crawl. You force them to explain their rage logically. You lure them onto unfamiliar emotional terrain. They will lose control of the dynamic, become profoundly uncomfortable, and ultimately defeat themselves.
Mae West won by shifting the terrain because there was still room to maneuver. But there are situations where the terrain is entirely locked, where a conflict has fossilized into this unmoving, agonizing stalemate, and any direct attempt to shift things is essentially suicide. To understand how to break that kind of paralysis, we have to look at the American Civil War and the grand strategy of General William Tecumseh Sherman.
The year is 1864. The Civil War has been grinding on for years, exacting a horrific toll in blood and treasure, and it has settled into a brutal stalemate. In the Eastern Theater, Confederate General Robert E. Lee has successfully entrenched his forces, protecting the capital of Richmond from repeated Union assaults.
And in the Western Theater, which is our focus, the Confederate Army has established an absolutely impregnable defensive fortress at the town of Dalton, Georgia. This fortress blocks the Union Army from advancing on Atlanta, which serves as the vital industrial and logistical heart of the Deep South.
And hanging over this military deadlock is a massive political ticking clock. President Abraham Lincoln is facing re-election in November of 1864. The Northern public is profoundly exhausted by the endless casualty lists. If this bloody stalemate continues into the autumn, Lincoln is deeply terrified that he will lose the election to a peace candidate who will simply negotiate an end to the war and allow the South to secede permanently.
The stakes are total. If the South just sits in their trenches and holds the line, they win the ultimate grand strategic victory. They don't have to march on Washington, they just have to survive until November.
Recognizing this existential threat, Lincoln elevates Ulysses S. Grant to overall commander of the Union forces. Grant understands that the war must be won through relentless pressure. He appoints his most trusted lieutenant, General Sherman, to command the massive Union forces in Georgia with a singular, desperate objective: break the stalemate, destroy the Confederate Army, and capture Atlanta before the election.
So Sherman arrives in Georgia, assesses the Confederate fortress at Dalton, and quickly realizes he is trapped. The Confederate commander at Dalton is General Joseph E. Johnston, a man universally renowned as a master of cautious defensive warfare. Johnston has positioned his army brilliantly, with impassable mountains at his back and massive, heavily armed fortifications in front.
The tactical reality was grim. If Sherman laid a prolonged siege to Dalton, the clock would run out, Lincoln would lose the election, the war would be lost. If Sherman launched a direct, frontal assault against those fortifications, he would slaughter tens of thousands of his own men for zero strategic gain. He was caught on the horns of a dilemma.
So Sherman formulates a completely unorthodox approach. If he cannot conquer the physical geography of Dalton, he decides to conquer General Johnston's psychology. He decides to weaponize Johnston's own defining personality trait, his extreme calculating caution, directly against him.
In May 1864, Sherman initiates his strategy. He orders three-quarters of his massive army to launch a loud, highly visible, but ultimately shallow frontal assault against the Dalton fortifications. It is pure theater, designed to look exactly like the brutish, unimaginative attack Johnston had been preparing for.
Johnston focuses all his attention on repelling this attack, but it's a massive feint. While the artillery is roaring at Dalton, Sherman secretly detaches the rest of his force, the Army of the Tennessee, and sneaks them through a treacherous mountain pass to a town called Resaca, located 15 miles south of Dalton.
And Resaca is the geographic key. It sits directly on the only railway line supplying Johnston's army, and it serves as his only viable route of retreat.
Suddenly, Johnston receives the horrific news. He isn't bravely repelling a frontal assault. He has been completely outflanked, his supply line is cut, and he is about to be surrounded and starved. Because his psychological baseline is extreme caution, Johnston panics. He immediately abandons his impregnable fortress at Dalton and desperately retreats south to protect his supply line.
But Johnston is a brilliant defensive engineer.
No.
He doesn't just run, he falls back to another highly secure, pre-selected defensive position further south, digs in, and once again invites Sherman to bash his head against a wall.
And what follows is this bizarre, massive, agonizing dance all the way down the state of Georgia. Sherman absolutely refuses to engage in a direct battle. He feints one way, sneaks a massive column around the flank to threaten the railway, and the cautious Johnston is forced to abandon his trenches and back up again. Over and over, they repeat this cycle, all the way to the outer defenses of Atlanta.
At this juncture, the political dynamic within the Confederacy shifts. The Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, watches this endless retreat with disgust. He feels Johnston is simply too cowardly to fight for the South. In a fateful decision, Davis relieves Johnston of command and replaces him with General John Bill Hood.
And this is where Sherman's mastery of the dynamic truly shines. Sherman knows General Hood's reputation intimately. If Johnston was paralyzed by caution, Hood is the exact opposite. Hood is highly aggressive, hot-headed, and notorious for reckless, bloody frontal assaults.
Sherman immediately discards his flanking strategy and designs a new trap perfectly tailored to Hood's psychological profile. Knowing he lacks the time for a prolonged siege of Atlanta, Sherman sends out small, temptingly weak Union detachments to maneuver provocatively near the city's outer defenses.
He literally dangles a piece of red meat in front of a starving wolf.
Hood's aggressive nature cannot resist the bait. He orders his army to abandon their strong defensive fortifications inside the city and rushes out into the open to crush these isolated Union detachments. But the moment Hood's forces commit to the attack, they find themselves rushing headlong into massive, hidden Union ambushes. Sherman repeats this tactic multiple times. Hood's army suffers catastrophic casualties and Confederate morale plummets.
But despite the slaughter, Hood manages to retreat back into the city, and Atlanta remains in Confederate hands. The clock is still ticking, so Sherman executes the coup de grace. At the end of August, he orders his entire army to march southeast, entirely bypassing Atlanta, and in doing so, he deliberately and completely abandons his own railway supply lines stretching back to the north.
From Hood's perspective inside the city, this movement defies all military logic. No general deliberately strands his army in hostile territory without a supply line. Hood logically assumes Sherman has finally run out of supplies and is retreating. Wild celebrations break out in the streets of Atlanta.
But it is a masterpiece of timing. Sherman executed this bizarre maneuver to perfectly coincide with the late summer ripening of the local Georgia corn crops. His massive army didn't need the railway, they literally ate the surrounding fields as they marched. While Hood is celebrating a false victory, Sherman's well-fed army swings in a wide arc, physically severs the final railway lines leading into Atlanta from the south, and surrounds the city. Hood realizes he is trapped and is forced to evacuate in the dead of night. Atlanta falls to the Union.
The capture of Atlanta electrifies the North and guarantees Abraham Lincoln's re-election, thereby saving the Union's grand strategy. But Sherman recognizes that capturing a city does not end the rebellion. He then executes one of the most famous, devastating, and controversial operations in military history, the March to the Sea.
Sherman takes his veteran army, divides it into 4 parallel columns, completely severs all telegraph and supply lines back to the north, and marches blindly east across the state of Georgia toward the port of Savannah. His army operates entirely independent of a base, living off the land, and systematically destroying the agricultural and industrial infrastructure in their path.
The tactical brilliance of this maneuver is rooted in ambiguity. Because they have no massive supply trains slowing them down, the Union columns move with terrifying speed. And because there are 4 separate columns spread across a 50-mile front, the Confederate command is completely paralyzed. They have no idea what Sherman's actual objective is.
The southernmost column looks exactly like it is maneuvering to attack the city of Macon. The northernmost column appears to be marching directly on Augusta. The panicked Confederate forces frantically scrambled to the flanks to defend those two cities, completely abandoning the center of the state, which is, of course, exactly where Sherman's main force drives straight through, entirely unopposed, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean.
Sherman articulated this strategy perfectly. He said he kept the enemy constantly on the horns of a dilemma. Every choice they were forced to make was inherently the wrong one.
The psychological impact on the South was absolute catastrophe. The Confederate soldiers fighting hundreds of miles away in Virginia under Robert E. Lee received letters that Sherman's army was marching freely through their hometowns, burning everything, and no one could stop him. The psychological foundation of the Confederacy cracked. Desertion rates skyrocketed. Sherman didn't just defeat an army, he shattered the willpower of an entire society.
To deeply understand the psychological mechanism of breaking a stalemate, the source text references a myth from ancient Greece, the story of Heracles and the giant Alcyoneus.
Oh, the mythology analogies in this text are fantastic. Break down how this applies to Sherman.
In the myth, the Olympian gods are engaged in a brutal war against a race of giants. Heracles tracks down the giant Alcyoneus and shoots him with a poisoned arrow. The giant collapses to the ground, apparently dead. But the moment his body touches the earth, he instantly springs back to his feet, fully revived and stronger than before. Heracles strikes him down again and again, but the giant keeps regenerating. The secret is that Alcyoneus is fighting on his native soil, the land of Phlegra. The earth itself acts as a battery, endlessly healing him.
So what does he do?
The goddess Athena intervenes. She yells at Heracles, "Drag him away to another country." So Heracles changes tactics. He physically wrestles the giant, drags him across the border out of Phlegra into the neighboring land of Thrace, and crushes him. Separated from his native soil, the giant loses his regenerating power and dies.
The profound insight here is that the dynamic of a stalemate acts exactly like that native soil. The Confederate trenches at Dalton, that was their Phlegra. Every time the Union Army attacked them head-on, the South simply absorbed the kinetic energy of the blow, repelled it, and grew stronger and more confident in their resolve.
Precisely. Sherman realized that engaging in that specific, predictable stalemate was just feeding the stagnation. A stalemate induces a profound mental paralysis. Both sides become locked in a narrow set of predictable responses. You lose all creative vision. You just keep banging your head against the same wall, hoping the wall gets tired. Sherman shattered that paralysis by executing a maneuver that appeared utterly irrational to conventional military thinking, cutting his own supply lines and marching into a void. He dragged the entire Confederate command structure off its native soil of predictable trench warfare and forced them to fight in an environment of total ambiguity.
The translation to modern life is stark. When you find yourself trapped in a reactive relationship or a corporate deadlock where every meeting circles the same drain and nothing ever fundamentally changes, you have to become as creatively chaotic as Sherman.
You must deliberately inject extreme novelty into the system. You have to force the opposing party to operate entirely outside of their accumulated experience.
It is analogous to playing against a chess master who is slowly, systematically dismantling your position. To break their cognitive rhythm, you purposely sacrifice your own queen in a bizarre, mathematically unsound way. To an observer, it looks like madness. But it forces the master to throw away the meticulous script they have been building for 20 moves and suddenly react to a completely chaotic, unstructured new reality. It breaks the mental paralysis of the stalemate.
Exactly.
But we have to acknowledge a hard truth here. All of these strategies we've explored, Rommel's blinding speed, Mae West's terrifying financial risk, Sherman stepping into the absolute unknown without a safety net, they all share a demanding prerequisite. They require an almost unfathomable level of internal fortitude, because the reality is you cannot hope to control the external dynamic of a conflict if you are internally controlled by fear.
That brings us to the psychological core of the text, conquering fear. And the source document provides an incredibly intense, harrowing historical account to illustrate the mechanics of this internal shift. We are looking at the early life of the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass.
The year is 1833. Frederick Douglass is a 15-year-old enslaved boy. He has spent the previous 7 years living in Baltimore, but his legal owner, a man named Thomas Auld, forcefully summons him back to a rural plantation on Maryland's eastern shore to labor in the fields.
During his time in the relatively urban environment of Baltimore, Douglass had accomplished something profoundly dangerous. He had secretly taught himself how to read and write. Within the brutal architecture of American slavery, literacy was viewed as an existential threat because it stimulated independent thought and exposed the systemic lies of the institution. And beyond mere literacy, Douglas had cultivated what the slaveholding class termed an impudent attitude.
He possessed an unyielding sense of his own humanity. He talked back to overseers. He questioned arbitrary orders. He even organized clandestine Sunday schools to teach other enslaved people how to read the Bible.
Thomas Hole determines that this spark of rebellion must be violently extinguished. He rents the teenage Douglas out for a period of 1 year to a local farmer named Edward Covey. Covey was notorious throughout the region. His entire economic livelihood and social standing were built upon his terrifying reputation as a consummate breaker of young Negroes.
Other slaveholders would send Covey their most defiant, strong-willed human property. Covey would utilize a systematic regime of extreme psychological terror, sleep deprivation, and relentless physical violence to extract maximum free labor from them, while simultaneously beating every last ounce of psychological resistance out of their spirits.
And for the first 6 months of 1833, Covey's brutal methodology succeeds entirely. He works Douglas to the absolute edge of human endurance. Douglas is shattered in body and spirit. The intellectual spark vanishes. He stops trying to read. He ceases interacting with his fellow enslaved laborers. He spends his rare days off lying in the dirt in a state of catatonic exhaustion, completely consumed by the crushing weight of despair.
The breaking point arrives on an agonizingly hot day in August 1834. Douglas is working in the sweltering fields, becomes violently ill, collapses, and loses consciousness. He awakens to find Edward Covey standing over him, holding a massive, heavy hickory club, screaming at him to stand up. Douglas is physically too debilitated to move.
Covey savagely beats the teenager. He kicks him, strikes him repeatedly in the head with the club, and leaves him bleeding profusely in the dirt, promising to return later to finish the punishment.
Operating purely on survival instinct, Douglas eventually drags himself out of the dirt. He staggers through the woods for several miles and makes his way back to his owner, Thomas Old. Covered in blood, Douglas begs Old for protection, detailing Covey's homicidal cruelty.
The response he receives is a chilling testament to the banality of evil. Old is completely unfeeling. He calculates that he has paid for a year of discipline, and he intends to get his money's worth. He allows Douglas to rest for a single night, but the following morning, he coldly orders the boy to walk straight back to Covey's farm.
Douglas walks back down that road, enveloped in absolute terror. He genuinely believes he's walking toward his own execution. He resolves to simply keep his eyes cast down, submit to whatever horror awaits, and pray to survive the remainder of the year. Upon arriving, he quietly enters the stables to begin his morning chores.
Out of the shadows, Covey launches an ambush. He slithers into the stable holding a thick rope, attempting to catch Douglas entirely off guard, loop a slip knot around his legs, and hoist him into the air for a final catastrophic torture session.
But as Covey lunges for the boy's leg, Douglas instinctively pushes back. He doesn't strike Covey, but he forcefully resists the rope. And in that precise split-second moment of physical resistance, something profound and irreversible clicks inside Douglas's psychology.
The paralyzing fog of fear simply vanishes. In that instant, Douglas realizes he is no longer afraid to die. He makes a conscious internal calculation that it is infinitely better to die fighting on his feet, asserting his humanity, than to be tortured to death on his knees like an animal.
Covey's cousin, who is hiding nearby, rushes in to help subdue the teenager. Douglas, realizing he is outnumbered, does the unthinkable. He turns and strikes the white cousin with immense force, knocking him violently to the ground. We have to understand the context. In 1834 Maryland, an enslaved person striking a white man was a universally understood immediate death sentence.
What Douglas later described as a fighting madness takes over. He turns his full attention to Covey and fights back with every ounce of strength he possesses. What ensues is a brutal, chaotic, intensely violent, 2-hour physical brawl in the mud and manure of the stable. Finally, Covey, bleeding, exhausted, and completely out of breath, gives up the struggle and staggers away toward his farmhouse.
Douglas waits in the stable, anticipating the inevitable. He assumes Covey is marching to the house to retrieve a shotgun or to summon the local militia to drag him to the gallows.
But the hours pass, and nothing happens. And slowly, the strategic reality of the dynamic dawns on the teenage Douglas. Edward Covey was trapped by his own mythology. Covey's entire livelihood, his identity in the community, his income, all of it depended completely on his carefully curated reputation as the ultimate invincible breaker.
If the local community of wealthy slaveholders ever discovered that a 16-year-old boy had fought the great Edward Covey to a standstill for 2 hours, and that Covey was so weak he had to resort to a gun to stop him, Covey's reputation would evaporate overnight. He would be a laughingstock. He would lose his entire business model.
It was strategically safer for Covey to pretend the fight had never occurred and simply leave the teenager alone. And for the remaining 6 months of Douglas's time on that farm, Edward Covey never laid a single finger on him again.
The source text includes an incredibly moving quote from Dallas's later autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom. Reflecting on that grueling 2-hour fight, he wrote, I was a changed being after that fight. I was nothing before. I was a man now. I had reached a point at which I was not afraid to die. This spirit made me a free man, in fact, while I remained a slave in form.
A free man, in fact, while I remained a slave in form. It is a staggering philosophical realization about the true locus of power. The text uses this historical moment to analyze the internal mechanics of fear. Fear is the most debilitating emotion in any human conflict. Why? Because before the enemy even makes their first move, your own fear cedes the initiative to them. It forces you onto your heels.
Your imagination does their dirty work for them.
Exactly. Tyrants, bullies, domineering bosses, they all share a predatory, almost instinctual ability to smell anxiety. When they sense that you are terrified of the consequences, terrified of losing your job, terrified of a humiliating public scene, terrified of physical harm, they recognize that they hold ultimate leverage over your behavior. By internally accepting the absolute worst-case scenario, death, Douglas systematically eliminated Covey's only point of leverage.
I want to pause here because it is vital to honor the intense, horrific reality of what Frederick Douglass actually faced. He was confronting literal, physical death and the daily abomination of chattel slavery. But for the listener driving to work right now, how do we translate this profound courage into our modern, everyday conflicts? If we aren't facing the gallows, what death are we actually so terrified of that we allow other people to dictate our lives? Is it social death? The fear of being fired? The fear of someone not liking us?
It is precisely those social and economic deaths that bind us. It is the deep-seated fear of confrontation, the fear of being labeled the bad guy or the difficult one in a social circle, the fear of severing a relationship, even one that is clearly toxic. The text's argument is that until you ruthlessly root out that underlying fear, you are incapable of controlling any dynamic.
Because if the other person senses that you are fundamentally afraid to walk away from the negotiation table, they will dictate the terms forever. They know you will always blink first.
The mechanism of liberation is counterintuitive. Abandoning the fear of consequences is what suddenly opens up vast new vistas of positive action. Once Douglas was no longer paralyzed by the fear of dying, his cognitive functions returned. He could fight back, he could strategize, he could eventually plan his successful escape to the north. The side that possesses more emotional possibilities for action, the side that is psychologically willing to go further, will always retain greater control over the dynamic.
Okay, so we examined how to confront overtly aggressive tyrants like Edward Covey, arrogant executives like Adolf Zukor, or massive mechanized armies. But we need to explore the exact opposite end of the spectrum. What if the person controlling your life isn't yelling at you, threatening you, or fighting you at all? What if they are constantly, exhaustingly playing the victim?
This shifts our focus to the most subtle, almost invisible form of psychological judo. This requires entirely abandoning kinetic force and instead assuming passive control.
To dissect this, we look at the legendary American psychiatrist Dr. Milton H. Erickson and a brilliant therapeutic concept he developed known as the utilization technique.
Early in his clinical career, Dr. Erickson made a profound observation. He noticed that patients frequently entered his office utilizing highly developed, entirely unconscious methods of controlling the relationship with the therapist. They wouldn't yell or make demands. Instead, they would exert total control through passive resistance. They would deliberately withhold vital information. Or they would enthusiastically agree to try hypnosis, but then subtly, internally resist falling into a trance. Or they would spend the entire hour endlessly complaining about how utterly hopeless their lives were and how therapy was clearly a waste of time.
They were engaging in complex games of passive domination. They were basically daring the authority figure to fix them while secretly ensuring the doctor failed, thereby proving their own tragic uniqueness.
Erickson recognized that if he engaged them directly, if he argued logically that therapy did work, or forcefully demanded they reveal their secrets, he was playing directly into their hands. He was validating their resistance and feeding their victim complex. So he developed the utilization technique. The premise is radical. You literally take the patient's own passive-aggressive resistance and utilize it as the very instrument to force them to change.
The source text outlines 4 specific clinical case studies of how Erickson executed this, and they are like watching a magician work. Let's walk through the mechanics of each one. Case 1, the secretive patients.
Erickson routinely dealt with patients who'd been coerced into therapy by a frustrated spouse or a demanding parent. They were deeply resentful of being there. Their primary control tactic was to sit rigidly on the couch and deliberately withhold all sensitive or useful information about their lives.
A conventional therapist would lean forward and say, "We cannot make any progress unless you trust me and open up."
Erickson inverted the dynamic entirely. He would sit down, look at the resistant patient, and calmly state, it is entirely natural and actually very psychologically healthy to want to keep your private life hidden from a stranger. In fact, I insist that you withhold any sensitive information from me today. I absolutely do not want to hear your secrets.
It's a massive paradox. It shorts out their cognitive loop.
The clinical psychology behind this is fascinating. The patient is instantly trapped by a paradox of command. Their entire unconscious goal entering the room was to rebel against the therapist's authority by keeping secrets. But now, if they remain silent, they are strictly obeying the therapist's command. The only avenue left for them to rebel, the only way to assert their independence, is to open up and talk. Erickson found that usually by the second session, these bitterly resentful patients would be talking endlessly, revealing their deepest traumas, simply to spite his explicit command to stay quiet.
That is a brilliant manipulation of the ego. Okay, let's look at case 2, the pacing man.
A man arrives for his initial consultation. He is vibrating with anxiety and immediately begins aggressively pacing back and forth across the small office. By refusing to sit in the chair, he is physically controlling the geometry of the space and making it impossible for Erickson to perform a standard hypnotic induction.
So Erickson doesn't order him to sit down and calm his nerves.
No, because an order creates a point of resistance. Instead, Erickson asks, "Are you willing to cooperate with me by continuing to pace the floor exactly as you are doing right now?" The patient, confused but feeling validated, says, "Sure." Then Erickson asks, "Can I direct where you pace and how fast?" The patient, operating under the illusion that he is still in control because he is still physically pacing, agrees.
Erickson literally asks for the steering wheel while the car is moving.
Once he has permission, Erickson begins issuing granular commands. Pace to the window. Now pivot toward the door. Now pace a little slower. He establishes a rhythm of compliance. Then, crucially, Erickson begins to artificially hesitate. He pauses for several seconds before giving the next direction. The patient, accustomed to the rhythm, actually stops pacing and stands perfectly still, physically waiting for Erickson's permission on how to move his own body next. After establishing this profound state of physical compliance, Erickson simply lowers his voice and says, "Sit in that chair." And the man sits down and instantly drops into a profound hypnotic trance.
He hijacked the neurological momentum of the anxiety. It's exactly like the martial art of Aikido. When someone throws a punch at you, you don't raise a rigid block to stop the kinetic energy. You grab their wrist and pull them forcefully in the exact direction they were already swinging until their own momentum causes them to fall over their own feet.
The text utilizes a fantastic quote from the legendary heavyweight boxer Joe Frazier to articulate this underlying principle. "It is not the same when a fighter moves because he wants to move, and another when he moves because he has to." Erickson made the pacing man feel like he wanted to pace until the subtle shift occurred where the man felt he had to pace according to Erickson's will.
That brings us to case 3, the cynical patient. This is the archetype of the person who desperately needs to prove they are intellectually superior to the expert in the room.
These patients view therapy as a gladiatorial contest. They want to one-up the authority figure to validate their own ego. Recognizing this, Erickson would deliberately attempt a method of hypnotic induction that he knew with absolute certainty would fail on this specific personality type. When it inevitably failed, he would put on a masterful performance of defeat. He would apologize profusely to the patient, lightly lament his own inadequacies as a doctor, and sigh heavily about how many times he had failed in his long career.
He is deliberately playing the pathetic loser to stroke the patient's ego.
The psychological response is entirely predictable. The cynical patient feels they have conclusively won the power struggle. Their ego is immensely satisfied, and because they feel completely victorious and intellectually superior to this sad, failing doctor, they completely drop their defensive guard. There is no need to guard against a defeated opponent. In the exact moment that internal guard drops, Erickson would seamlessly slip them into a deep trance, utilizing a completely different, highly subtle induction method.
He loses the battle on purpose to instantly win the war. And finally, case 4, which is perhaps the most visceral because it mirrors so many toxic family dynamics we all witness. The husband faking a weak heart.
A woman comes to Dr. Erickson in a state of total despair. Her husband utilizes a supposedly weak heart to dictate her every waking moment. He refuses to contribute to household chores, he isolates her from her friends, and he demands constant suffocating attention. If she attempts to push back or establish any boundaries, he dramatically clutches his chest, gasps for air, and declares that the stress she is causing him is going to trigger a fatal heart attack. The medical reality is that multiple cardiologists have thoroughly examined him and found his heart to be perfectly healthy. It is pure, unadulterated emotional terrorism.
The wife is trapped. She is furious at the manipulation, but she is paralyzed by the guilt of, what if he actually does have a heart attack and it's my fault?
Erickson understands he cannot confront the husband directly. The husband will just have a fake heart attack in the office. So he instructs the wife to return home and act incredibly, overwhelmingly sympathetic. But he provides her with a very specific behavioral script. The next time the husband clutches his chest and complains about his fragile heart, she is instructed to politely and warmly say, "Oh, you poor dear, you must rest immediately. Please lie down. I need to go tidy the house so you have peace and quiet."
And then the trap springs. What does she do?
As she tidies the house, she deliberately leaves glossy promotional brochures from local morticians and funeral homes spread out in highly visible locations on the coffee table, next to his favorite chair, on the kitchen counter. The next time he complains of palpitations, she immediately goes to the desk in the living room, pulls out his life insurance policies, and loudly starts using a heavy, clacking mechanical adding machine to calculate the financial payouts.
It is so incredibly dark, but it is a masterpiece of strategic reframing.
At first, the husband is predictably furious. But very quickly, a genuine, profound fear sets in. He absolutely hates seeing the mortician brochures. The loud, rhythmic clacking of the adding machine terrifies him. Erickson has taken the husband's chosen tactic, playing the victim hovering near death, and made it too psychologically painful and awkward for the husband to continue utilizing. He drops the fake heart condition entirely because the resulting sympathy from his wife is infinitely worse than doing his own laundry.
The underlying analysis here is crucial. The text emphasizes that dealing with passive-aggressive individuals who weaponize weakness, whether it's claims of depression, chronic anxiety, or being constantly overburdened at work, is the hardest dynamic to break. Because if you attack them directly, you look like a monster attacking a wounded bird, and they get to play the victim card even harder to everyone around them.
They are strategically elusive. They construct a narrative that they aren't seeking control at all, they are just seeking help. But the text insists you must coldly recognize that there is far less actual helplessness in their behavior than they are projecting. They are heavily invested in forcing the relationship to operate exclusively on their terms.
So the absolute worst tactical error you can make is to argue with them, complain about their behavior, or try to forcefully push them to take responsibility.
Arguing feeds their victim complex. It validates their narrative that the world is against them. Instead, you deploy Erickson's judo. You agree with them, you're overly sympathetic to their plight, but you structure the interaction so that whatever they do, they are actually cooperating with your ultimate desires. Or, like the wife with the mortician brochures, if they insist on using a specific weakness as a weapon against you, you agree with their premise so aggressively and take it to such a cartoonish extreme that their chosen tactic becomes too painful to maintain.
You completely outmaneuver them in subtle control, which leads us to the final, somewhat terrifying conclusion of the text, the reversal.
In the vast majority of strategic manuals, there is a section dedicated to the reversal, how to counter the strategy or how to do the exact opposite. But our source text offers a harsh, fundamental truth regarding the dynamic of control. There is no reversal.
Let's linger on that. So after all of these intricate strategies, Rommel's audacity, Mae West shifting the battlefield, Sherman embracing chaos, Erickson's psychological judo, is there truly no way to just opt out? Can we not just choose to decline the control game entirely? Can we just exist in a totally egalitarian, chill state where nobody is manipulating anybody?
The text argues forcefully that such a state is an illusion. Any effort you make to appear as though you are not controlling a situation, any attempt to visibly refuse to exert influence over a relationship is, in and of itself, a highly effective form of control.
So by throwing your hands up and ceding power to someone else, you are still dictating the dynamic by forcing them to take the wheel.
You grant yourself a very specific kind of passive authority. You remove yourself from the risk of making a bad decision, and you simultaneously position yourself as the ultimate judge of how well the other person handles the responsibility you dumped on them. The text quotes the Prussian king Frederick the Great. In order to have rest oneself, it is necessary to keep the enemy occupied. If you attempt to step back and chill, you are simply shifting the cognitive and emotional burden of action onto your partner.
This maps so perfectly onto everyday social life. Think about that specific person in your friend group or perhaps in your relationship who constantly defaults to, I don't care, whatever you want to do is fine. You pick the restaurant, you pick the movie, I'm easy.
They genuinely mind they're being accommodating and low maintenance.
But look at the underlying mechanics of what they are actually accomplishing. They are forcing you to perform all the emotional labor. They are forcing you to analyze the options, make the executive decision, take the social risk of making a bad choice, and carry the mental load of planning the evening. That seemingly innocent, I don't care attitude might actually be the most insidious, exhausting control game of all. Because if the restaurant you choose is terrible, it is entirely your fault, not theirs. They retain ultimate passive authority while doing zero work.
The source text is absolute on this philosophical point. There is no escape from the control dynamic. It is a fundamental law of human interaction akin to gravity. Those who loudly proclaim they are opting out of the game or who claim to be above the petty squabbles of power are simply playing the game on a deeper, more disguised, and often more manipulative level.
So, to synthesize this entire massive journey we have been on, we began with the philosophy of the boxer, learning that true control isn't about throwing the hardest punch, but mastering the time and space of the environment. We watched Erwin Rommel utilize blinding speed and literal smoke and mirrors to keep the massive British army so constantly on their heels that they effectively defeated themselves.
We analyzed Mae West handing back a fortune in cash, risking total ruin to subtly shift the battlefield from a predictable fight over an actress's ego to an unpredictable debate over script quality and comedic timing, completely disarming the titans of Hollywood.
We followed General Sherman as he shattered a bloody, paralyzed stalemate, not by attacking a brick wall, but by cutting his own lifelines and marching into the terrifying unknown, injecting pure chaos to break the South's cognitive rigidity.
We dissected the profound internal courage of Frederick Douglass, realizing that fear is the ultimate tool of external control, and that by accepting the risk of his own death, he stripped a tyrant of all available leverage.
And finally, we explored the subtle, paradoxical judo of Dr. Milton Erickson, utilizing a patient's own passive resistance to trap them into a cure, proving that even the most helpless acting victim is actively engaged in a fierce battle for dominance. Controlling the dynamic is never about aggressively micromanaging people. It is about shifting the terrain, dictating the pace, and above all, mastering your own internal emotional state.
Which leaves us with a final, rather profound question to ponder based on the text's premise. If there is truly no reversal, if we are all constantly inevitably engaged in this invisible lifelong battle of wills, what happens when two absolute masters of the dynamic finally meet?
Oh, that is a fascinating scenario.
Think about the implications. If neither individual can be baited into anger, if neither is blinded by internal fear, if both inherently understand how to continuously shift the terrain to find equilibrium, does the game ever end? Or does it transcend the nature of conflict entirely and evolve into an unspoken, perfectly balanced choreography? Watch the people in your life that you respect the most. Observe long, highly successful marriages or legendary business partnerships. Look closely at how they interact. Are they fighting or are they dancing?
The invisible X-ray of their relationship isn't showing broken bones anymore. It's showing a complex, beautiful waltz. That is an incredible thought to leave on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to step back, look closely at the board in your own life, and start defining the rules of your own game.